Asa Winstanley is an investigative journalist living in London who writes about Palestine and the Middle East. He's been visiting Palestine since 2004, and he writes for the award-winning news site Electronic Intifada, which I'm sure many are familiar with, where he's an associate editor and co-host of the Electronic Intifada podcast, which is fantastic. He also writes a regular column for the Middle East Monitor, and he's done just outstanding work covering this group, Labor Friends of Israel, and sort of similar Israel lobby groups and the impact they've had on the UK Labour Party. I mean, it's a major part of his reporting, including their secret purge lists, the downfall of Jeremy Corbyn, and the mistakes Corbyn made in fighting baseless charges of anti-Semitism. Asa was all over those stories. So we're hoping for his insights about the UK, given that there's a parallel movement here in the US with, I would say, unremarkably similar aims, the so-called democratic majority for Israel. So Asa, thank you very much.
Well, thanks, Grant, and it's great to be with you all. So as Grant said, I am going to be talking about the Israel lobby in the UK. I'm focusing on organizations that term themselves left-wing Zionist organizations, and they are, in my view, Israel lobby groups, and their discourse is in fact right-wing because their discourse is, when it comes down to it, Zionist. And there's a lot of the same dynamics with the group Labour Friends of Israel that Phil described actually with J Street. LFI very much terms itself a Zionist group, and it has a lot of the same dynamics there. So I think that, and so to give a very, very brief overview of how the Israel lobby works in the UK, it works slightly differently, although there's a lot of parallels. So there's I'd say the main difference is that there's no direct equivalent in terms of its sheer size and influence to AIPAC. So there has been attempts to sort of start a British AIPAC. There's this organization called BICOM, the Britain Israel Research and Communications Center. It tends to focus more on journalism, and it's really nowhere near as big as AIPAC. It has managed to have some key influences in a lot of ways, but it doesn't hold a torch to AIPAC. The real equivalence to AIPAC in terms of political influence, the lobby's political influence on British politics, and I would say, and I argue, Israeli state interference in the British democratic process are the so-called Friends of Israel groups. So you have Conservative Friends of Israel, Labour Friends of Israel, there's even a smaller Liberal Democrats Friends of Israel, and there's even a UKIP Friends of Israel, I haven't heard much about it in the last couple of years, but there was a brief attempt to start one, I think. So you have these different groups which are aligned with specific political parties. And so Labour Friends of Israel is quite similar to a newer group, I suppose, that Grant mentioned, Democratic Majority for Israel. But Labour Friends of Israel is a much older group. So Democratic Majority for Israel was begun in 2018 in the context of the wave of progressive Democratic Congress members like Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez, Ilhan Omar, Rashida Tlaib, and so forth, the so-called squad, which, initially there was a lot of hope on the left that they would be very different on the issue of Palestine, especially since one of them is actually Palestinian herself, Rashida Tlaib. And so there was a kind of panic, I suppose, in the progressive the Democratic Party establishment, and within the Israel lobby, and this organization, Democratic Majority for Israel, was formed. Its main function has been really attack. They went after Bernie Sanders in a big way. They put out these very expensive attack ads. I think I don't think those adverts were very effective, actually. I mean, I think they were pretty poor quality. But I mean, I think if Bernie Sanders had somehow managed to win the presidential nomination, you would have seen a lot more money go into that, I think. And I think that would have been a very big thing. Phil, I can hear some guitar music.
Some beautiful music there. This is Grant. I just want to applaud whoever's playing that beautifully.
Thanks, Phil. Yeah. So there was this kind of so Democratic majority for Israel. They kind of have this function of flak, I suppose. Labour Friends of Israel in the UK has quite a similar function in terms of going on the attack, and absolutely when they went on the attack against Jeremy Corbyn, but also the Jewish Labour Movement did, which is another pro-Israel Zionist organization within the Labour Party. But I'll focus in this presentation on Labour Friends of Israel a bit. So the one of the main differences with Democratic majority for Israel is LFI is a far older organization. So it was launched in 1957. So it's old, you know. It was launched in the context of the Suez War, the tripartite aggression of Britain, France, and Israel against Egypt when they invaded Egypt after Gamal Abdel Nasser nationalized the Suez Canal. You know, there was this plot to invade Egypt and make, you know, Britain and France intervene to quote unquote separate the sides and be peacekeepers, but that was all, as was soon found out, was all a pretext. So what happened in the context of the Labour Party? So it's important to recognise that the Labour Party, the British Labour Party, historically was incredibly pro-Israel. Like, it was very, very, very pro-Israel. Like, even the most left-wing leader, one of the most left-wing leaders that the party ever had before Jeremy Corbyn, Harold Wilson, who was really on the soft left of the party, but he had a lot of very left-wing cabinet members in terms of domestic policy, at least. Harold Wilson was an out-and-out Zionist. Like, he was incredibly pro-Israel. You know, he was a supporter for Labour Friends of Israel, and he wrote a book about Israel, and all these kind of things. So Zionism had a kind of ideological hegemony over the British Labour Party, really, and this is described very well in Christopher Mayhew's book. Christopher Mayhew and Michael Adams' book, Publish It Not. Christopher Mayhew being a former mid-level British cabinet minister in Labour governments in, I believe, the late 40s and 50s. And he talks about some of those dynamics there. What happened in the wake of the Suez War is the Conservatives were in power, and it was Anthony Eden who infamously launched the war because, you know, partly because he had a grudge against Nasser and all this stuff. But what happened was the Labour Party, despite its support for Israel, had a kind of qualified opposition to the war on Suez. It wasn't a principled opposition. It was more of an opportunistic opposition in terms of that it would be bad for British imperialism, essentially, you know, because this was really if you look historically at Suez, it was really the last British imperialist mission that was kind of independent of the American empire. And of course, the Americans infamously put their foot down after that, because they hadn't informed the Americans, and, you know, all these, without getting into the whole history of that. Essentially what happened was there was the Labour leadership at the time in opposition saw it as a way to criticize the government, you know, and they said, well, this will be bad for British interests and so on and so forth, the way they did it, because there was no UN permission for the invasion of Egypt, you know. But they were very much against Nasser as well. It was this kind of thing. So it was a very limited opposition to the war. However, what that meant was that for the first time among the Labour Party elites, the Labour Party political leaders, there was this, for the first time since 1948, I should clarify, there was a real danger of a kind of split, so that the leadership would, the political hegemony of Zionism and the British Labour Party would start to fall away. And that is indeed what happened historically, and has happened since then. And Jeremy Corbyn was, if we fast forward to 2015, Jeremy Corbyn was really more of a symptom of that long-term decline of the Israel lobby, the Israel lobby's influence. And so Labour Friends of Israel was formed as a way to kind of get back that influence. And it started off as a membership organization. I'll just read a very brief extract from this book, The British Left and Zionism, History of Divorce, by British academic Paul Kellerman. It's a very good book on this topic, and he describes the genesis of Labour Friends of Israel. And he says that LFI had been launched after the Suez Crisis with the support of 40 MPs and on the initiative of Polit Zion leaders. Polit Zion was the forerunner of Labour Friends, the Jewish Labour movement. On the initiative of Polit Zion leaders who had urged a new approach to rebuild the British Labour movement's relations with the Israeli Labour Party. Unlike Polit Zion, LFI did not restrict its members to Jews. In the early 1970s, it reported 17 branches, mainly in London, and 700 members, though they were essentially contacts with few demands made on them. And then it goes into more detail about its activities. It funded study tours for trade union leaders to go to Israel, MPs, party officials, and so forth. But by 1978, it was in decline. Now, if you fast forward to today, if you look on LFI's website, and they have actually just very recently spruced it up, it looks quite slick, I have to say. But if you go onto the website, there's no way to join as a member. If you're a Labour Party member, you can't join LFI. So where the JLM, you can join as a member, whether you're Jewish or not. They have, you have to be Jewish to be a full member, but you can be what they call a solidarity member. So LFI has long since stopped being a membership organization because of just the decline of its popularity, of Israel's popularity. And just the increasingly, as Phil described, openly right-wing turn that Israel has taken over the decades. So instead, what they have is what they call supporters. So they have supporters in Parliament. So they have MPs who still, even though as far as I can tell, those MPs just say they're quote unquote supporters, and they put them on their website. And then to a greater or lesser degree, they may be involved in LFI's activities. But what I would say, so there's similarities and differences between LFI and Democratic Majority for Israel. But what I would say is one very close parallel is this issue of how the issue of Israel and the issue of Zionism has become contested within the grassroots base of the respective centre-left parties. So, time after time, poll after poll shows that although the Israel lobby has this kind of hegemony at the top of the Democratic political party in terms of its leaders, and historically it was the same in the Labour Party, and now it's back again with the demise of Jeremy Corbyn in the Labour Party. At the base of both parties, it's the exact opposite. It's completely rejected. And this recent article of mine, there was a recent polling of the Labour Party membership, which shows that a big majority of Labour Party members support the boycott, divestment and sanctions movement. And they also reject the, I think it was 61% who supports BDS. And they also reject the anti-Semitism smear campaign against Jeremy Corbyn. And it was even bigger, and polls all along of the attitude of the Labour Party memberships, the attitude of Labour Party membership to this idea that Jeremy Corbyn was an anti-Semite, is an anti-Semitite. It was rejected all along by the membership, and it still is now. So, and this article was from just after a couple of months after the 2019 general election. That was massive. You know, it was 73% who said that anti-Semitism in the Labour Party was either exaggerated or quote unquote invented. So very, very strong. I would say the major purpose of both organizations, LFI and the newer organization, the Democratic Majority for Israel, is flak. They are kind of attack dogs to punish and defame politicians who are viewed as critical of Israel. I'd say that LFI has been far more effective against Corbyn in alliance with other groups like the Jewish Labour Movement. So the successes of LFI, we have to admit there has been. So it took part in the end of Corbyn. You know, it coordinated with the Israeli Labour Party, and at one point the LFI and the Israeli Labour Party worked together to formally cut the Israeli Labour Party's links to Jeremy Corbyn, to the leader of the Labour Party. You know, that made headlines in this country, in Britain's very parochial, corporate press, that this was just another example of quote unquote anti-Semitism, which is bizarre. You know, you'd think it would be a good thing, because, you know, as Phil described, you know, the Israeli Labour Party is incredibly right-wing and incredibly racist as a Zionist party. But LFI now, with the demise of Jeremy Corbyn and the leadership of Keir Starmer, his successor, is very much back. LFI is very much back in with the leadership. You know, he's had several meetings with LFI, the shadow front bench, Keir Starmer's wannabe ministers, if they would ever win a general election, which I think incredibly unlikely, regardless of what I would like to see or not. Objectively, I think it's incredibly unlikely. Several of his shadow front bench have made a show of joining LFI as supporters. And Starmer's only real policy, you know, he's been incredibly vague. Like, I mean, regardless of whether or not I support him, which obviously I don't, his politics are far to the right of mine. But just objectively speaking, if you look at what he's articulated as the Labour Party's policies under his rule, there's nothing. There's absolutely nothing. You know, there's vague talk about real voters, and they do this kind of nationalistic nonsense where they've started flying the flag, both the British flag and the English flag, and they're just trying to get to what they view as the halcyon days of New Labour, of Tony Blair and Gordon Brown, and so forth. But he does. There's one exception. He does have one policy which he has carried out very extensively, and that was one he declared during the leadership campaign to succeed Jeremy Corbyn as leadership of the leader of the Labour Party, and that was when he told the Israeli site Times of Israel, well, it was reported in the Times of Israel anyway, quote, "I support Zionism without qualification." So this was during a debate jointly organized by the Jewish Labour Movement and Labour Friends of Israel. And all three of the candidates, actually it was four at that stage, one of them later dropped out. That it was four at one stage. I can't remember if Emily Thornberry took part in that debate or not. Actually, I don't think she did. Anyway, all of the candidates declared that they were either Zionists or supporters of Zionism, you know, and that even included Lisa Nandy, who was at that stage supposedly the leader of a group called Labour Friends of Palestine, which is really a kind of defunct group. It hasn't really had any activities in the last couple of years. So it was a very clear signal that Zionism was back in the political hegemony of the British Labour Party in terms of its leadership. So Starmer's, in my view, Keir Starmer, they see their job as, Keir Starmer and the people around him, their only real job is actually to purge the Labour Party of its membership, because the membership has, the the membership's still overwhelmingly sympathetic with Jeremy Corbyn and with the agenda for change that he put forward, because it was really, I mean, objectively speaking, Corbyn's political agenda was not very different to even right-wing Labour leaders of the past, even some, you know, Tory leaders, Conservative governments before Margaret Thatcher. The policies of Jeremy Corbyn would not have been out of place in. Where he was different was that he had this anti-imperialism, that he had this very cynical attitude towards, skeptical attitudes towards Britain's role in the world and Britain's subservience to the British, to the American military presence around the world, American wars, and of support for the Israeli government. So that was different, and that was why there was such an all-out war against Corbyn. So I support Zionism without qualification is really Keir Starmer's only real policy. So what we do know about LFI is that it is effectively in my view, a front organization for the Israeli embassy. It has incredibly close ties to the Israeli embassy. And this explains, in my view, why part of the reason, at least, why it is not a mass membership organization. It's not actually formally affiliated to the Labour Party, unlike the Jewish Labour movement, which is able to argue that it's, you know, the representative of the Jewish, quote unquote, Jewish community within the Labour Party. The LFI doesn't, and because there's this formal affiliate thing, they relationship with the party, they have to disclose certain things, but LFI doesn't have that. You know, it just calls itself LFI. High profile politicians support it, therefore it is associated with the Labour Party. But in reality, there is this intimate relationship with the Israeli embassy. And the main reason that we know this is thanks to Al Jazeera's series, The Lobby, which, I mean, I'm sure most people will be familiar with it, but it was an undercover investigative series, which Al Jazeera came out with in 2017. They spent 6 months undercover in the Israel lobby in the UK, and the revelations that it came up with were really brilliant. But I think it's worth just playing this quick clip to remind us of a scene in it.
The embassy helps us quite a lot. You know, when bad news stories come out about Israel, the embassy sends us information so we can sort of counter it, getting it directly from a horse's mouth, as it were. It's quite helpful. We work really closely together. But like, a lot of it's behind the scenes. We've got to be careful because I think there's some people which would be happy to be involved in a young LFI, who wouldn't necessarily be happy if it's seen as an embassy thing. So I think Shy helping with background, So I think definitely keeping Shy up to date and letting him know what we're doing. I think we just have to be careful for it not to be seen as a young Israeli embassy, like we want it to be distinguished by itself. So like, we do work really, really closely together. So it's just publicly, we sort of try and keep LFI as a separate identity to the embassy, because being LFI allows us to reach out to people who wouldn't want to get involved in the embassy. Keeping it as a separate thing is actually better for everyone, because ultimately we've got the same end goal of getting more people to be pro-Israel and to understand the conflict. So it's just how you do it.
Thanks. So that was Michael Rubin, one of Labour Friends of Israel's staff members, and he was speaking to Al Jazeera's undercover journalist, who he thought was a pro-Israel activist. And what had happened is that Shai, this man from the Israeli embassy that Michael Rubin was talking about in that clip, had really recruited Robin to start a new organization, which would have been Young LFI, a youth wing of Labour Friends of Israel. And you see in that clip that Michael Rubin is very, very self-conscious about not being seen to be directly controlled by the Israeli embassy. But he said, we actually do work really closely together, but it's good to have separate identities, because otherwise there would be too many people who wouldn't want to have anything to do with us. And this speaks to what I was describing earlier about the historical decline of the image and the popularity of the State of Israel within the grassroots of the British left. Shai was, of course, Shai Massot, who was really the center of this undercover investigation. He was supposedly a senior political officer at the Israeli embassy. Documents that we later obtained at the Electronic Intifada later on, after the Al Jazeera revelations, suggested that he was very much actually a part of the Ministry of Strategic Affairs, which is a sort of covert, semi-covert intelligence agency, really, in my view. You know, it's a ministry, but it's really involved in undercover activities and political interference. You know, so what we have in the British Israel lobby is there's all these groups which are ostensibly independent, and they do have their own degrees of agency, and they do have their own degrees of separation, but a lot of these groups are either directly front organizations or coordinated with the State of Israel itself. And we saw this dynamic very much at play with Shai Massot, where he was putting forward Robin, who he also thought obviously was a pro-Israel activist, to be the leader of this new organization, Young LFI. And so we see that we see two dynamics at play. There's this kind of fear that they're going to lose their influence. And, you know, it's as Phil said, you know, once these things start changing, they can happen very, very quickly. You know, that things can change. The sort of political hegemony that I described can be lost very, very quickly. And I think the same dynamics are very much in play. But the other dynamic that we see is that they are still very much clinging on. Michael Rubin now, he was then a sort of junior staff member of LFI. It wasn't very big. They only had, I believe, 2 or 3 staff members. And they had a series of volunteers. And of course, they had MPs who worked for them, like Joan Ryan. But Michael Rubin is now being promoted. He's still there. He's now the director of LFI. And he played a really important role in Corbyn's takedown, which I don't have time to get into, but he authored a secret report as under the label of Labour Students, which was a sort of right-wing group, infamous right-wing group within the Labour Party. And that report on so-called anti-Semitism, which was allegedly taking place at the Oxford University Labour Club, had a really devastating effect. And it really played a key role in the whole narrative of, alleged anti-Semitism within the Labour Party. And that was authored by this same guy who was in close coordination with Shai Massot, close coordination with the Israeli embassy, with the State of Israel's intelligence organizations. You know, that's what it was. The Ministry of Strategic Affairs is staffed by former members of Israeli military intelligence, Mossad, and other Israeli spy agencies. So, you know, what we've got really is covert interference in the democratic political process of foreign states by what is a hostile foreign power. It's certainly hostile to the Labour Party and Jeremy Corbyn. I think I've almost certainly run out of time, so I better wrap up. The bad news is that these smears of anti-Semitism, they worked against Corbyn in terms of power. Corbyn is doubly out of the Labour Party. He's no longer the leader of the Labour Party. He was briefly suspended as a member. He's the Labour Party member, but he's not a Labour Party MP, you know, because Keir Starmer's blocked him from being in the Labour group in Parliament. So he's been, you know, kind of cast out of the Labour Party in that way. But the good news is in the long term that the disinformation campaign failed to convince the majority of the Labour Party, as we showed earlier in the polls, which suggest that reject it. And just anecdotally, if you speak to Labour Party members, no one really believes it. But, you kind of have to say it if you have a high profile mainstream media platform, which is why I never get invited on to the BBC, Channel 4, or even something like Novara Media. There was Al Jazeera, of course, filmed a second series on the Israel lobby in the USA, which there's a whole story about that, it was censored. I don't have time to get into that, but there's a really key moment in that. You can watch it online at the Electronic Intifada. There's a really key moment in that where Eric Gallagher of the Israel Project, another smaller Israel lobby organization, he used to work for AIPAC too, and he is lamenting in that scene at the end of the series where he says that their influence is no longer what it was. And he says that, and actually not long after that, in 2019, his own group collapsed under what it cited as a funding crisis. And what Eric Gallagher said was, quote, "The foundation that AIPAC sat on is rotting. There used to be actual widespread public support for Israel in the United States. So I don't think AIPAC is going to remain as influential as it is. I don't think that AIPAC is the tip of the spear anymore, which is worrisome because who is?" And I think the exact same worries are happening within the British Israel lobby, which is why we saw such a real moral panic and freak out about Jeremy Corbyn. You know, this is the kind of good news for us, I suppose. So yeah, that really concludes my presentation.
Excellent.
And thanks for listening.
Well, now